Hello, everyone. Ladislas Maurice from the wanderinginvestor.com. So today I'm very happy to have Lyle Taylor on board. So we did a video about 10 days ago in which we discussed how we were both buying Russian stocks. We bought the dip and then the markets crashed, and now a lot of our positions are sitting at zero. So we wanted to have this discussion to ask ourselves, what is the way forward? So Lyle, how are you? Thanks for coming today.
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, obviously, I've been better, but in the circumstances, I'm doing fine. And just before we get into the specifics, I just kind of want to say up front that war is a terrible, terrible thing, and this is an inexcusable war. And I could see how a lot of people would sort of question the morality of investing in Russia, or even thinking about it obliquely. But it's important to emphasize that nobody here is profiting from war, right? This is the worst case scenario that could have happened for Russia and Russian asset prices. So in that respect, it's not profiting from the war. That's actually one of the biggest risks. So, but yeah, just I thought it was worth making that clear up front.
Great. So I looked at my interactive brokers account, and a lot of the positions that I bought are now have a zero or, just a few dollars. You're in a similar situation. So what are your thoughts moving forward?
Yeah,
Where do we stand with these Russian stocks that we have in our portfolios?
sure. So the first thing to emphasize is that certainly there's been some very significant legitimate declines in prices, very significant. But there was also towards the end a breakdown in the market plumbing. So what happened with some of the sanction news is that there was uncertainty about the scope of the sanctions, and some of the settlement providers basically said we're not settling any transactions in Russian assets, and this in particular impacted the global depository receipts in London. So basically, you had a situation where trading basically couldn't happen, and volume collapsed. And then you had some brokers, basically allowing sell-only transactions. And so you had on the final day where the prices fell to practically zero, you had some market dysfunction. And you could see that in the fact that Lukoil was trading, for instance, at 40 cents in London, and it was still trading at $14 in US at the same time. So the price declines were sort of more in the order of 70 to 80%. There is a few companies that are still trading, like Rusal, which trades in Hong Kong, is down about 30 or 40%. And in in Russia itself, the stock market's been closed, so we're not quite sure. But there have been a lot of confluence of things impacting prices. So in terms of where we stand at the moment, look, right now, from a fundamental impact, it's too early to be sure that the losses are going to be devastating. What's actually happened is that the risks of an eventual zero or an eventual catastrophic outcome have gone through the roof. But really, what happens is going to depend on how the war resolves, and particularly how long it goes. Because what's happened so far is that after the war broke out, we saw the first round of sanctions announced on the Thursday. And actually, they were much less severe than even I was expecting. They were actually very mild, and stocks rallied. They didn't cut off SWIFT. They only sanctioned a few Russian banks. There was carve out for energies. There was no sanctioning of Russian oil, etc. What subsequently happened was that with all the social media, images and all the news, that the level of outrage about what was going on just spread, and there was essentially political demands on Western governments to do more. And they have done more. They've done a lot more, but they still haven't actually sanctioned the Russian export sector. The US has just banned imports of Russian oil in the United States, but they very specifically not banned other countries from doing it or sanctioned it. And they know that the oil flows can sort of move around. So the economic impact is very significant, but it's not utterly catastrophic yet. And it's also the case that China is still working with, what a lot of people have forgotten is that the world has changed. It's not just the US and Europe anymore. You've got China, you've got India, you've got a lot of these places that aren't actually participating, where there still will be market impact. But the impact has been much more severe. And one of the surprises has been the self-sanctioning that we've started to see, where companies have said, we're allowed to do it, we just don't want to do it. Like Microsoft and companies like that saying, we're not going to operate in Russia anymore. So the short term, the impact is going to be very significant. But But what will matter is there like a peace deal, some sort of peace deal or resolution to the conflict in the short run? And we can talk more about that. If there is, I think we could actually start to see a rapid de-escalation, and there are even scenarios where there could be a full recovery scenario, or it could be the case that the war not only draws on but actually takes a much nastier turn, like and then Russia's just going to be awful for a very long period of time. And yeah, and the I should have mentioned too, the nuclear option was sanctioning Russia's central bank reserves. So this is very, very significant, because suddenly it's thrown into disarray. Their ability to manage the currency fallout, etc. So they've basically put capital controls on. They've kept the stock market closed. They've restricted people from pulling money out. I think they're doing that. They might be retaining some optionality for confiscation. We can talk about that risk, but I think for the most part, it's just dealing with this potential foreign currency crisis of capital flight now that they don't have their reserves, and I think that's understandable. The desperate times call for desperate measures. They are still running a very large current account surplus though, for the time being, and so they will be able to work through that, and it will slowly thaw. But in the short run, you won't be able to pull out any money. So,
because I've had quite a few people ask me, Ladislas, are you selling? I mean, one, I'm not able to sell, but two, even if I was able to sell, at the current valuations, I would not sell anything because they're priced like cheap options at this point.
I mean, at the current prices, especially the price, it's probably the single most asymmetric trade you'll ever see in your life. But there is a significant risk it goes to zero. But I think that's still a minority risk. Like again, it's worth emphasizing that right now Russia is still selling gas to Europe. It's still selling oil. A lot of the other export industries like aluminium, etc., are still selling products. There's been some disruption to the trade because like some people haven't wanted to take delivery of Russian oil because they're not sure if somebody's going to want to buy it and things like that. So there's some, but those things will be worked through. So lots of these companies will still be actually, for the time being, very, very profitable. And if there is any kind of favorable resolution, I know in the heat of the moment, it's much like with COVID. When COVID was breaking out, there's a tendency to think, that the world's changed forever, and it has in some respects. But it's also important to remember that it's not necessarily the case that this war is going to go on a long time or lead to the sort of long-term changes that everybody thinks is now inevitable. And because there are some scenarios where things could actually work out much better than people think, I think I totally agree with you on that.
Also, one of the key learnings from this situation is the pace of de-globalization and the fact that one is exposed to risk depending on one's own passport. So I'm a little worried, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. As a Western citizen, so I have stocks in Hong Kong, for example, and I'm now worried about risk if there were ever tensions between the West and China, or if China made a move on Taiwan, etc., that suddenly, because they know the game plan now, they know what the West will do. They'll freeze Chinese people's assets overseas. They'll freeze Chinese central bank reserves that are sitting overseas. So chances are my brokerage account from day one in Hong Kong will get completely frozen. So I'm now taking extra risk just because of my passport.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is potentially one of the biggest deglobalization events that's ever happened. But again, I would still caution to not kind of overreach for the implication. At times when you're in the heat of battle, you've got to really wait for the dust to settle a little bit. But yeah, very much the case. And it might not even be, it could even be more proximate than that. Like certainly if there was an invasion of Taiwan, you could see the same thing happen, the seizure of China's foreign exchange reserves, and then China turning around saying, well, we'll just, we will confiscate multinational assets in the country, et cetera, until we get them back. But even more proximately, China is not participating in the sanctions and has been very opposed to them. And right now there aren't that many sanctions, so they can still buy oil and exports and stuff from China, but from Russia. But if they every single day the West is doing more and more and more and more, right? and they might keep introducing more sanctions. And if China violates them, then the West could start to get into things like secondary sanctions. They could say, well, China, we're going to start sanctioning China. We're going to start, and it could even escalate to that even in the short run. So it is a risk. I think it's going to have very significant implications for how foreign exchange reserves are held. Is China really going to want to sit on trillions of dollars of US dollar, treasuries if they can be potentially seized at any moment? Perhaps physical gold becomes the preferred currency for central bank reserves in the future. So yeah, pretty big implications, and also the risk, I think, of confiscation has gone up. For multinational companies operating around the world, and even if it's not confiscation, if there's a geopolitical event, if you've invested for 20 years, like if you spent 20 years building a business in Russia, for instance, and then there's one geopolitical event and you have to just shut everything down, you lose your entire investment. And and if it only lasts a month, then it can be very, very costly to try to get back in at any stage. And so even short of outright confiscation, the operational risks have gone up very, very significantly. I agree.
So you mentioned a bit earlier on the potential for a peace deal. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, sure. So, I think firstly the context, like in our last call, I said I thought it was a very remote possibility that this would happen. And clearly I was wrong about that and misappraised the probability. It's worth mentioning that it surprised a lot of people. And there's news that there's dissension even in large parts of the Kremlin. Most of the Russian elite have spoken out actually against the war. And so this seems to have been a somewhat emotional decision that Putin has taken, and people were very surprised about it. But anyway, it's happened. I think the context here is in assessing the probability for a peace deal is to ask, what is actually Putin trying to do here, and what was his expectation? And it seems like he had convinced himself that Zelensky was a U.S. puppet government, and so there wasn't any real popular support. He saw Ukraine as their Slavic brothers. And there's no way that they would be anti-Russia and getting into bed with the enemy of NATO, etc. And he sort of had in mind almost like a state-sponsored coup where they just walked in. They not only asked the Ukraine to put down their arms, but they asked the Ukrainian military to join them in a coup. And so there's a huge level of delusion here. And they thought they'd just walk in, change the government, and basically they wanted a pledge of NATO neutrality. They wanted recognition of Crimea and the Donbass, and the demilitarization of East Ukraine, which would also be accomplished with the bombing campaign for a few days. He did not anticipate he was going to be getting into this sort of situation. He certainly wouldn't have anticipated the huge level of domestic resistance, so now he's got himself into like this terrible quagmire where ordinary Ukrainians are taking up arms, and they're facing the potential of like a guerrilla war in the cities. And even if they win certain battles, which will be bloody and hard fought, trying to occupy and govern is going to be basically impossible. So it's been an unmitigated disaster, right? And what's interesting is that if you look at what he's actually come out with, the latest demands are actually a significant walking back from what they originally wanted to accomplish. So Russia said a day or two ago that their conditions for peace are pledge of neutrality, recognition of Crimea and the Donbass, and they said that military operations will immediately cease if that happens. So they're not looking at occupying, they're not looking at removing Zelensky. They've significantly curtailed their ambitions, and I think they realize that this has been a blunder. And Putin's fighting for his life back home. He's lost a huge amount of support. They've introduced a whole lot of incredibly repressive measures. They've locked 10,000 people up for protesting. And that repression is very much a negative, but it also shows the tenuousness of Putin's position, the fact that he's needing to resort to these kind of measures. So really the uncertainty now is Zelensky going to be willing to agree to those terms? And we don't know the answer to that question. I can certainly see how he would say, well, we really shouldn't give you anything in Crimea, or it's a guarantee you don't try this again in the future. But the alternative is is that Putin cannot just, he's backed himself into a corner. He can't just unilaterally back out. It'll be a huge embarrassment domestically, internationally. Everyone will say Russia's weak, they lost the war. So if he can't get that deal, the alternative is he's going to have to up the ante, including using artillery and aerial bombardments, and the war could get really, really ugly. So it's sort of this binary sort of thing. It could either get a lot worse and last a long time, or there actually could be a peace deal. I think people are underestimating the probability of a peace deal. There's been peace discussions ongoing. The Western media isn't really covering it. Is very skeptical because they think that Putin is sort of trying to reconstruct the USSR and all this sort of thing, Hitler incarnate. But actually, there are some quite advanced discussions already happening, and I think the probability of a peace deal is actually probably going by some of Zelensky's recent comments. It probably about 50%. Not like it's going to take just in days or anything like that. There's still a lot of negotiations, but I can definitely see a path there. Now, if that happens, it's going to be incredibly positive. Because I think you'll see a huge sigh of relief in the West. It'll fade from the news. You won't have this continuous escalation of anti-Russia rhetoric and everything. And they may even take some of the most severe sanctions off, including the central bank. Potentially, it'll certainly come with a caveat that if you try anything at all like this again, it's coming straight back on and a whole lot more. But you could actually start to see a normalization. But even if that doesn't happen, the current sanctions regime is actually not that bad if you take away self-sanctioning and people just being averse to being associated with Russia at all. And I think things will actually thaw and normalize pretty quickly. And I think a full recovery is actually probable. And it's worth bearing in mind too that when we talked about it, the stocks had already fallen very substantially to a level that embedded a very significant risk premium for war. So if there is a resolution, I don't think Russia's going to do anything like this again. If there's a peace deal, they will have learned their lesson and they dispelled a lot of their illusions. And even if they recovered to the levels they were at before the invasion, they would still be extraordinarily cheap relative to the realistic geopolitical risks moving forward. It'll take a little bit of time for money to come back, but I think people will be shocked actually how quickly Russian asset prices recover under that scenario. But yeah, if we don't get that scenario, things could remain ugly, and they could potentially escalate to the point of everything being a zero. I mean, the ultimate worst case scenario is outright confiscation. So the West seizes their foreign exchange reserves, they seize all the Russian assets overseas, and they turn around and retaliate. But I think it's actually not as easy to do as you might think it is, because Russia does not want to expropriate China or Chinese. And there are a lot of countries around the world that have not participated in sanctions, and there actually isn't that much in the way of Western money in terms of holding financial assets. It's not a big concentration. And so they'll have to be very careful, and it's not always easy to determine who actually owns the assets. Like there are a lot of Russian money that's managed, like my funds in the Cayman Islands, right? There's a lot of Russian money that's domiciled in tax havens and offshore vehicles, a lot of Chinese money. So it won't be easy. And they surprised everyone the other day when they said that they actually would pay debt payments, even to foreigners of hostile countries that they've deemed, but only in rubles, but they will pay in foreign currency to non-hostile countries. But a lot of people were shocked. They're like, why would they do that? Why would they, So I think confiscation is a risk, but I don't think it's likely. But if the war grinds on, especially if it gets taken to an even more bloody level, it's just going to be proper ugly. There's going to be more and more stuff done every day. And the risk that the sanctions and everything are taken to a level, and restrictions are taken to a level, and retaliatory responses that basically wipes a lot of these things out goes up commensurately. So it's a very risky situation. So we'll have to see how it unfolds. But I'm still actually somewhat optimistic with all those caveats. I certainly think the risk reward is extraordinarily asymmetric at anything remotely close to the prices that stocks have been recently trading at. But but there are some worst case scenarios that could play out.
All right. Thank you very much, Lyle. We're certainly all praying for peace.
Yep, we certainly are.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me back. See you, everyone.